Hey guys, welcome to the studio. So today we're going to be taking a look at my latest painting, Conflagration, and some of the techniques that I used to create it. Before we get to that though, I just have one thing to say, and that is thank you so much to all of my patrons over on Patreon. Your support means the world to me, and I wouldn't be able to do what I do without it. Thank you so much. Alright, let's dive in. So this painting actually has its roots in a lexicon, which I attended as an exhibitor for the very first time back in October of this year. And while I was there, I had the pleasure of meeting Mark Sheff. Mark is an artist and a curator who runs a website called Everyday Original. And Everyday Original specializes in offering small, affordable, original works of art. And he was really impressed with my work and said, hey, I'd love to have you on the site. And I was like, oh, I'd love to be a part of it. So what that meant was when I got back from the show, I started doing sketches and thinking about, okay, I need to do a piece that is small and affordable. And usually on Everyday Original, that means less than $500. So I whipped up a couple of digital studies for Mark, and here they are. I knew I wanted to do something that was really punchy and would read well from a distance because, again, the key here is a small piece of art. I'm not doing something super huge where I can necessarily have a crowd full of fleeing civilians and lots of small details and stuff. This needed to be, or needs to be, an image that is going to be very immediate and works with big shapes. So here we've got this giant woman stepping out from behind a building, and there's a huge fire. And, you know, I'm really channeling one of my first big art heroes, Caravaggio. A lot of his paintings are very focused on dark black shadows with a single area focal point of strong light. And I tried to bring that into the modern age, I guess, with this piece. But it's really rooted in old master type techniques. I never rely on just my first study, though. I always want to do at least 3 typically because, you know, sometimes the first idea is the best idea and that's what you should go with. But oftentimes it's not, and working on subsequent ideas, you flesh things out more and have realizations that you maybe didn't have when you were working on that first one. Now, in this case, I went in a totally different direction for the second study. You know, one of my favorite categories of pieces that I do are my industrial scenes. You know, I watched a lot of like Gundam and Megas XLR and giant robot stuff growing up. So these hangars with huge mecha are really burned into my imagination. So in this one, you know, this woman's being called to duty and she's getting ready to go kick some monster butt and is stepping out from the hangar. And yeah, I tried to basically make it the antithesis of the previous piece. I mean, besides the lighting, it's still got that kind of classic chiaroscuro going on, but the perspective is totally reversed. You're not looking up at her, you're now looking down, and it's gone from an urban landscape to industrial. And yeah, so that was the second one. And then this one is actually the fourth one. We'll get to the third one in a minute, but I could kind of tell while I was working on the second one that I wasn't sure it was really, you know, it's not necessarily working. I still like the idea, but that wasn't the right execution of the idea. So I went back to the urban idea. I really, you know, it was just sticking in my brain. There needs to be a big inferno. I want a giant fire lighting her up from below. Let's explore that concept from a few different perspectives. So in this one, now we're on the roof looking at her, trying to get a little bit closer, emphasize the sense of scale, you know. I didn't put it in this digital study, but, you know, there's going to be like a small person on the roof next to her hand. But, I showed this to my good friend Jacob Green, who you can follow at Jacob Green Art on Instagram. He's fantastic. But, you know, we were both kind of agreed, you know, I'm not sure that this is the right direction either, which actually brings us to the third study, which is this one. And I could kind of just tell, you know, like this is really working. I'm feeling good about this one. And actually, I use a program called DAZ 3D in order to do some of these early digital studies. It lets you pop in a 3D model of a figure and pose the figure and add lights and stuff. And, you know, I don't know really anything about 3D modeling, but the program is easy enough to use that I can construct a very simple scene and get a rough idea for what I'm trying to create and not have to waste any time inventing things like, you know, how's the light going to ripple across her abs or whatever. You know, the program will do that for me and let me get the study out fast. But anyway, all that to say, this is actually the same digital scene as the first study. I just moved the camera around. And I think for a piece that's supposed to be small and punchy, this is maybe a little bit more immediate and works better. And I felt good about it. So at that point, I decided, okay, this is what we're going to run with. Let's start shooting some photo reference. So I hired a model who's a good friend of mine from art school. And I built this set in my basement using cardboard, which is something I do all the time. It's a really easy material to work with and helps me get large, blocky shapes like buildings would be. We started shooting reference. And the really cool thing about shooting reference with a model is that you can make tons of small adjustments and get tons of variation, and happy accidents happen, So part of what you can do with those accidents is if you have one that you really like, you can start combining different pieces. So I like this pose, but I didn't really like her left arm, but I really like the left arm in this one. So, okay, we can work with that. Let's pop them both into Photoshop, and we can cut the arm off the one I like and staple it onto the previous one and kind of Frankenstein this thing together. And yeah, it's really versatile that way. So when I have a model over, I shoot tons of photos and we do tons of little variations, where it's like 50 photos that are basically the same, but her head's cocked a little bit differently, or the light moves slightly, or just whatever. And then I pull those all later and combine them together. But anyway, so I like the pose and the right arm of the previous one, but I like the left arm of this one. And then I also preferred these shiny pants that you can see in this one. But I still wanted to have the legs showing and not have it actually be pants. I just wanted the material. So that was, again, something that could be done very easily in Photoshop. I just cut out the shape of the shorts from the previous photo, but did it to this photo so that I had that kind of shiny material. And at that point, with my 3 main reference photos all clutched together, I made this digital study that you can see here. And actually, what I did for this was I took that study that I liked, study number 3, and I just took the photo pieces and collaged them in. So this is a combination of my initial digital study with the photo reference all combined together. And at this point, this is good enough for me to start painting, basically. Now, if I was doing a more complex piece, I usually would go a little bit farther and refine it a little bit more. But basically, this painting is really a portrait in a sense. I mean, it's more than the head, but the focus is basically the figure. So yeah, this was good enough. And the next stage of the process then is I use a grid to transfer the study to my canvas, or in this case, the canvas board. So, this piece is 9 by 12 inches, so it was really easy to do a 3 by 4 grid. So there's a 3 by 4 grid on my computer screen. You can kind of see me looking down to the left occasionally. And then I do a 3 by 4 grid on my piece and just transfer it by hand. And then I try to reproduce the digital study as faithfully as possible using raw umber paint. And you didn't see me doing this part, but before I actually even start doing the transfer, I will do a raw umber wash over the whole board or canvas. And the reason for that is to kill the white, as my painting professors would say back at school. And the reason you want to do that is, I'm trying to think how to describe this. So, for example, say you want to paint a really bright light, okay? Well, if the board or the canvas is already white, you can't go any brighter than that. So you need to have darkness in order to paint light. So having the white of the canvas when you're trying to paint skin or anything for that matter can really cause you to misjudge the color and the value that you're putting down. And an easy fix to avoid having to go and rework huge areas of the painting later on is to kill the white. So the first thing I do is put down this raw umber wash, and that just kind of gives me a nice neutral tone to work with later on. Because, I didn't used to do that when I was first starting off, back around 2015 or so. I would just start painting as if I were painting the final part, because I was basically, like if there was a face, I'd just start painting the face and finish the face in one go. And then what I would find is I'd have mismatched sections, where, oh, this skin tone doesn't match this part. And then, oh, I added this dark smoke cloud, and suddenly all the stuff I painted before is way too dark relative to the smoke cloud, so I'd have to redo tons and tons of work. It was a huge hassle. But I learned from my mistakes, and I read a really fantastic book by a 19th century painter named Solomon J. Solomon, and he was super, super helpful. Long dead, obviously, but I really, when people ask how I was taught to paint, yes, I went to art school, but I also say, I was quote unquote taught by Solomon J. Solomon because I found his book so valuable. I'm trying to remember the title if you're interested. It's Practice of Drawing and Painting, I'm pretty sure. But again, Solomon J. Solomon is the author, so if you look that up, you'll definitely find it. But as you can see, still transferring the drawing in this case. I tend to spend a long time doing this part because I want it to be right. I don't want to slam it in super fast and then have a lot of errors that I need to correct later. Having a strong drawing as the foundation is always a good thing. But it's also important to point out the things that I don't worry about. So, for example, the building that she's got her hand on, or the building behind her, I don't try to draw out every single perspective line and window and stuff. At least not on this particular piece. In other pieces that are a little bit bigger, more detailed, I would. But here, I was confident enough that I'd be able to figure out those details later on. So you don't really notice it in the sped up sections of this video, but I had a lot of problems when I was doing the drawing of the painting. Was trying to fall off my easel, so I used a drawing board and wizened up and had the painting propped against that, and that helped a huge amount. Usually I paint on a stretched canvas with a thick frame inside, and my easel kind of grips that a little bit better. I didn't have that here, though. So at this point, the drawing's all done, and you can see I'm slamming in colors now. And the thing I'm trying to do at this point is I'm trying to block in all the color and value as fast as possible while still being as accurate as possible. Now, I know at this point I'm going to have to come back in later and do a ton of corrections, and things aren't going to be the right value or the right color necessarily. But same, I was talking about killing the white earlier. It's really hard to make decisions about how something is supposed to look unless you have other things around it to base that off of. So you can see I'm finally starting to paint skin here, but the rest of the painting's been filled in first. And that's really a key part of my process, is working back to front and then from least important to most important. Now, some would argue, the fireball is probably most important, or at least way up there, and I would agree, but I also know that, a fireball does not need a lot of attention the way a face does, or the hands, or, other areas. It's super bright oranges and yellows, but it's loose and can be gestural because it's a fire. So I knocked that in first and then started doing the buildings and the blue light behind her. And with those areas addressed, I can start seeing, okay, the skin needs to be this bright or this dark in order to stand out and be contrasted against these areas. You might have noticed that I've got a couple different sticks that I'm using at various points here. Let's talk about the one I'm using right now, which you can see in brief flashes. That is a makeshift maul stick, and that is spelled M-A-H-L, maul. Typically, or historically rather, that was a stick that might be like a foot or two long, and it'd have a big cotton tip. It's that way you can actually push it against the piece of art you're using. And then you would just rest your drawing or painting hand on the stick, and then you have a stable platform to work from. I don't have one of those, so I just took a offcut from, I think I was making a 6-foot canvas back in art school or something along those lines. But basically, it's just a long stick, and I just rest it against my easel or against the drawing board and rest my hand on it. The other stick you might see me use sometimes, which I haven't used it super recently in the video, but I was using it a lot during the initial transfer stages. Doesn't really have a name that I'm aware of. My drawing professor always just called it a skewer because it's a skewer, like the kind you'd put like a kebab on or something. but you could use anything for it. Other artists use pencils or other brushes or whatever. Mine just happens to be a skewer. But the way you use that tool is, it's almost, imagine a clock face. Okay, so like, it can be 12 o'clock or 3 o'clock or whatever, and the hand points at different angles to match the time. So you point the stick, or rather hold it out in front of you like a clock face at wherever you're trying to measure, whether that be the angle on a building, or, I'm looking at my computer screen and I'm looking at my digital study and saying, oh, her leg is bent at 5 o'clock, or the building on the left-hand side is at 12 o'clock because it's up and down. It's just perfectly straight. So I'll hold the stick out and match the angle, and then hold it back up to my painting and reproduce that same angle, and then I can transfer it accurately. So it's another transferring tool, basically. Another great way you can use that stick is looking at the piece here. Okay, if I hold the stick up perfectly horizontally on her right arm, I can see that it cuts through her face right about the nose. Or if I hold the stick up right, so it's up and down from her right armpit, I can see that it comes down and kind of cuts through her hip and runs parallel to the side of her stomach. So a lot of times, the key to getting a accurate likeness or making things look realistic is all about proportions. So using the stick both to take measurements like the clock face I was talking about, or to compare different points on the figure, I can more accurately reproduce them. If I say, oh, she's holding her hand up and it's at the same height as her eyeball, or whatever, or in this case, her left hand, look at that fist. If I were to hold the stick up perfectly horizontally coming off the bottom of that fist, it would cut right through the black of her shorts, So I'm looking at that on my digital studies saying, oh, where's this line up with that? And then when I go back and paint it, I go, oh, make sure that lines up with that, and then it looks correct. I realize that it can be kind of hard to picture what I'm talking about unless you actually see it in action. So let me know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in, and I'd be more than happy to put together a quick drawing/painting tutorial where I show you a little bit more detailed method of how to use those tools properly. Because, if you're trying to do realism in drawing or painting, measuring is a huge part of it, really. So right now I'm painting the shorts, as you can see, and I think it's important to talk about the use of the photo reference right here, because the reference I shot, there was no fire. Obviously, I can't light a fire in my basement. I used light bulbs, specifically LEDs with around, I think, 55 or 6500 Kelvin light. And what that means is the light is very blue. It's not really orange at all, like an incandescent bulb would be. So when I take these photos into Photoshop and kludge them together into my photo reference, I'm not only, cutting pieces out and moving them around or collaging them, I'm also going into levels and curves, and I'm adjusting the color balance and stuff. I had to add orange to get that color accurate to look like it was actually being lit by a fire. And then even here when I was painting the shorts, or I'm doing her hair right now, and now moving down to the torso, although I stick very closely to the digital reference and the photos I shot, I'm still not 100% beholden to them, So when I was painting the shorts, for example, I brightened it up a little bit more even, and I actually made it a bit more orange because I wanted to really capture the bright orangeness of the fire, and then same thing with her hair. I really emphasized the blue of it. I know in, the footage here, it's kind of grayed out and it doesn't accurately capture what I was actually seeing and what it looks like in person. But, although I use the reference heavily and it's a very important part of my process, I am not strictly copying the reference. It is there ultimately as a guide, a very informative guide, but still a guide. And, if I decide I need to diverge from it, I do. So, you can see here I'm painting the sports bra right now that she's wearing, and I think it's kind of funny to point out the area I've left unaddressed so far, which is her face. That's for a couple reasons. One, like I was talking about earlier when I was talking about killing the white, faces, they're what we look at first because we're people and we're drawn to other faces and we're social creatures and all that jazz. So I typically wait until I have as much of the painting figured out as possible before I go into a face, because I want to, again, get the colors and the value to be as accurate as can be on the first go. Not that I won't go back in and make adjustments if needed, but I do want to try to nail it if possible, on the first attempt. That almost never happens, but still. And then the second reason is that I almost always save the super hard parts for the end as well. Like her right hand, the hand against the building. If you look at the photo reference, there's little gaps between each finger and stuff, and I knew that was going to be super tricky, so I didn't try to do it on this first pass. I was like, oh, let's just block it in, and then when I come back again, because I'm going to go through and repaint a lot of the painting and add to what's already here, then we'll try to figure that out. And that's a bit of a procrastination thing, but also a legitimate technical decision, because, again, by the time I get back to do that hand for real, I'm going to have even more information from the other areas of the painting to go off of. And as you can see, now I've finished the face. Everything on the painting is totally covered. There's no more bare canvas showing. Now we're going back in and we're starting to add details. And as I mentioned earlier, I work from back to front and then least important to most important. And that's not 100% strict. I might bounce around if I feel the desire to, or if it makes sense. But yeah, so in this case, I decided that I'm going to do this background building. And that was because, for one thing, it is the farthest in the background, and also because if I mess up and accidentally mess up her arm or her torso, or just the brush slips or whatever, I know that I'm going to go back and repaint her anyway, doing a more detailed pass. And if I make a mistake and have to correct her anyway, I'm going to do that anyway. It would be much riskier and less tactically sound to go through and paint her perfectly 100% and then go and do the background and have to try to paint around her, because I'm, much more likely to mess up at that point. So, and here's, an example of that jumping around a little bit. I started painting the windows, and I knew that there's this transition area where the windows are going down, and I apologize for the blurriness here. I didn't realize while I was filming that the focus was off, but anyway, I knew I was painting these windows and they're going down. They're going to blend into the fire. Well, I'm going to need to start fixing the fire then too, because I'm going to merge those two areas together. So I mixed up these bright oranges and yellows and started painting that area to transition into the building that I was already painting. And another reason that I have to do this is not just to refine it and make it more detailed, but also because, oil paint, unless you glob it on, is thin, especially when you use painting mediums like I use. I use a mix of odorless mineral spirits and linseed oil with a little pinch of linseed stand oil, which, again, if you're interested in those, I can do another video on paint mediums. Let me know in the comments. But all that to say, paint is thin, so as it dries, I can actually see, bits of that initial raw umber underpainting coming through the painting. And it was especially egregious in the brightest part of the fire. It actually kind of looked dirty because there was some of that brown coming through. So letting that dry and then coming back to paint over it in the second pass, I'm painting a little bit thicker, a little bit more opaquely. I've adjusted my painting medium mix a little bit, and then that new layer of fire covers on top of the initial layer, and that helps push back that underpainting even more. It doesn't totally obscure it everywhere. It is good painting technique usually to let a little bit of that underpainting pop through in certain places. Like you'll see when I post the final finished piece at the end, there's a little bit in her abs where you can see some of the underpainting poking through, and old masters did that all the time, and it kind of just adds a nice variation and textural variation to the painting. That may not be something you want, though. It is totally valid to totally obscure the underpainting just as much as it is to leave large areas of underpainting. It really varies from painter to painting, painter to painter, painting to painting. It's all stylistic. But yeah, generally I try to cover up most of it, and I'll just kind of leave hints of it throughout. Oh, you can see right there, I held the stick up horizontally. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier. I was checking the windows to make sure that they were all level. They're not perfectly level, but they were pretty close. And, I think that little variation and human error element is kind of nice too. Again, it keeps it from looking like a perfect digital robotness. It kind of adds that human element. And you look at old master paintings and classical paintings in museums, and you kind of see areas where like, oh, that's funky and a little bit messed up, and they're not perfect. They're beautiful paintings, but they do have these like little areas of like flubbiness or whatever. And I think that organicness is important. As you can see here, I'm painting back over the blue background of the sky. As I have said a few times now, I paint back over most of the painting a second time and make further adjustments, further refinements. Here I'm brightening it up, that light source even more, smoothing out the gradients. And here's another area where the underpainting was popping through a lot, way too much. I wanted it to be a more significant dark to really pop her face, so I went back in with a darker color. And another part of that too was that I wanted to sculpt her face a little bit more, the bridge of her nose, her brow, the profile of it. So I needed to come back in with that dark paint to help bring out the light paint. So I'm working back into all these areas and further refining it and adding thickness and all that jazz. A little phone photo there. Ooh, there you go. You can really see it now. It's much less blurrier, and as things dry, it looks a little bit better, less reflective. I'm going back in now and finally tackling an area that I was a little bit dreading because I knew I was about to have to paint a lot of windows in perspective, which, I talked earlier at the beginning of the video that I felt confident in my ability to do that without having to draw it out beforehand. And while that is true, that doesn't make it any less of a pain. But it's necessary, and I love doing it as much as I dread doing it. It's one of those things that it's love hate. It kind of comes in waves, whether you're really enjoying it or really slogging through it. People talk about loving what you do, and I absolutely love making these paintings. But having said that, that does not mean that I spend every second of it going like, yeah, this is the best thing ever. There are definitely points where I'm like, oh my God, I hate this. You have to like push through it. There's me using that stick again, like I talked about. I was using it to get accurate perspective lines in this instance. The vanishing point is right on her hip where the blue highlight on her shorts is. And again, if you don't know about perspective and vanishing points and all that jazz, that's another thing I could definitely do a tutorial video on. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in. That's another very important tool in the toolbox of creating realistic drawings and paintings is perspective, and something that I notice a lot of when I see artists who are starting out. They don't they know just enough perspective to do it incorrectly, but it's really not that complicated once you get the core principles down. So let me know if that's something to be interested in. But yeah, here I am painting in these windows, and skipped ahead a bit. So I apologize. The phone camera. I'm using a DSLR to film this. It's not a phone. I don't know where that came from, but it films in 20-minute chunks and then it stops. And if I don't come back and start it up again, I just missed that footage. So that's what happened there. But there was a lot of both positive and negative shape adjustment in doing these windows. And what I mean by that is, I had the dark shape of the window that I was painting, the black. It's not actually black, but we'll call it black for the sake of the argument. But then, I might mess that up where it's not perfectly square, or there's like a little paint blob that I need to go back and correct. So then I have the negative shape where I'm taking the building color and, readjusting that window shape both from within the window and outside of the window to get it perfectly square. And it's not perfectly square, but to get it, to a place where I think it looks good. And here I'm going back in now and I'm adding little like window shades and just, to add a little bit more texture and detail to make it look less like just dark squares, to give it that just extra little touch. And I think it really helps, especially as I'm recording this, I'm pointing at the computer screen. You guys can't see that. But the fourth window from the bottom where it's like half of a curtain, I think is especially effective there. I really like that one. And now we're going back into the figure. So I've basically, at this point, I've totally finished the background elements. The fire's done, the building's done, and really the only reason I would go back into those areas is if, as I'm painting the figure, I have a mistake or I realize that I need to go back and further adjust one of those areas because of how the figure is turning out. But otherwise, really all that's left at this point in the process is going back into areas of the figure that I think need help. So yeah, we're really at the end of the painting process for this one. I've let it dry for a week and now I'm dusting it off and preparing for varnish. Specifically, I use Gamvar, and the reason for that is Gamvar is a semi-permeable layer that allows the painting to continue to dry underneath it. And what I mean by that, the oil paint, depending on how thick you paint, it can take years before it fully dries. It may be dry to the touch after a week or two, as this piece is, but on a chemical level, it's still drying for years and years. And that's because oil paint dries through oxidation, not evaporation, like with water. So if you use a traditional varnish like Damar and you haven't let the painting fully dry for like a year, it'll keep trying to oxidize and dry underneath the surface, but it's not able to because of the thickness of that varnish layer, and then it cracks and crumples underneath. Gamvar, though, doesn't do that. It is semi-permeable, so it can still allow oxygen molecules to pass through, and that lets the painting dry properly, or at least that's what Gamvar, or the Gamblin people, say. And so far, I've used it since 2015, and I haven't had any problems with it. I really like Gamvar, so highly recommend that. But as you can see, during this varnishing process, I go over it quite a few times. Specifically, I'm going over it with the brush, trying to hunt for hairs and flecks of dust and stuff. And varnishing, it's one of the parts of the process I love the most, but also one of the ones that stresses me out the most, because I just know I'm going to miss a hair or a speck, and it's not going to become apparent until after the varnish is already dried. It happens every time. This one actually turned out pretty well, thankfully. It's always an exciting day when I come down to check the painting and don't find a gigantic hair. But and here it is. It's all finished and photographed, and super proud of the way it came out. I think if you go back and look at those initial digital studies, you can really see how closely I match the piece to that digital studies in the photographs. But still, there's those variations in there. It's not a perfect one-to-one copy. And obviously, things like the windows weren't really in the initial study at all. I mean, there were the suggestion of windows, but not this particular layout and this level of detail. That's something that emerged through the painting process. I think it's important, to come into a piece with a strong vision, lots of preparation, good reference, all that. But it's also important, to never lose that element of open-mindedness as you're working on a piece. As you work, something may present itself and cause you to reevaluate the plan and make changes. And that always happens every painting I do. It may not be a significant change, but there is always something, and I think that's what kind of puts the art in artist to a degree. Go ahead and throw up a image of this piece framed, because it does come with a frame. Again, this is going up on Everyday Original for sale exclusively. That's going to be on December 26th, so we're just a week away. And I know on Everyday Original, they allow people on their mailing list first chance to pick up a piece. So if you're interested in this, make sure to sign up for their mailing list at everydayoriginal.com, because they're going to message you on December 26th and say, hey, this is available before everybody else, and that'll give you that chance to snag it. So again, this piece, it is titled Conflagration. It is 9 by 12 inches oil on canvas board, framed, of course. And, you know, if you didn't know, rather, this is a painting in my Vigilant Lioness series. This is a series I've been doing for a few years, heavily inspired from the shows I watched as a child and a bit of the dysfunction that I experienced growing up in my household. The rough story for all these paintings, it's these giant heroines saving people from giant monsters. And I write a little story snippet with each piece. So I'll go ahead and read that for you now if you're interested. Her heart was booming in her chest as the fire washed over her legs. She could feel the heat, no question, and even see the fact of its presence in the blackened cars and melted storefronts at her feet. But it didn't hurt as she waded through it. Not even a little. She'd previously undergone the transformation to run drills and training exercises, but it wasn't the same as actually being called into service. The director had warned her that the process of ascending changed the very core of her being. Still, it was a shock to find that something so fundamental as being burned by flame no longer held true for her. It was with a morbid excitement then, full of adrenaline, that she stared down the burning boulevard at the monstrous colossus rampaging through the city, the thing she'd been sent to vanquish, and the only thing that could harm her. If you guys made it this far through the video, thank you so much for watching, and of course, thank you so much, patrons. I really appreciate it. As I said at the beginning, you guys are a huge part of why I do this and why I'm able to do it. If you would like to become a patron, just go to patreon.com/Matthew Huntley. I'll put that link in the description, and you can join the community. Love to have you there, and thank you again so much for taking the time to watch this. I hope it was informative, and have a great rest of your day. All right. See you in the next one.